The emergency landing at Forward Operating Base Chapman was unlike any Sarah Martinez had ever experienced. Her damaged A-10 touched down heavily on the rough airstrip, the left engine finally giving up completely as she rolled to a stop. Smoke poured from the engine compartment, but the aircraft had done its job, bringing her home alive after the most challenging mission of her career. As she shut down the remaining systems, Sarah could hear the distant sound of rescue helicopters returning with the survivors she had helped save. Ground crews rushed to her aircraft, their faces showing a mixture of relief and amazement as they surveyed the battle damage. The A-10 had taken multiple hits from small arms fire and rocket-propelled grenades, but its legendary durability had kept her alive throughout the mission. Staff Sergeant Coleman arrived within minutes, her experienced eyes cataloging the damage while expressing quiet pride in both the aircraft and its pilot. Word of the successful mission spread quickly through the base, but Sarah was more interested in learning about the condition of the rescued aircrew than in receiving congratulations. The medical reports were encouraging. All 3 survivors had been extracted safely and were receiving treatment for their injuries. The rescue that many had considered impossible had been completed without the loss of a single American life. Lieutenant Commander Williams found Sarah in the debriefing room an hour later, still wearing her flight suit and looking exhausted from the adrenaline crash that followed intense combat. His expression was serious but respectful as he took a seat across from her, clearly processing what he had witnessed from his position on the ground. The SEAL officer who had questioned whether any pilot could fly low enough to be effective now had his answer. The ground perspective of Sarah's flying had been even more impressive than the aerial view. Williams described watching her A-10 thread between the mountain peaks at altitudes that seemed impossible for a fixed-wing aircraft, delivering precision fire against targets that were sometimes only meters away from friendly positions. The accuracy of her gunnery under those conditions was something he had never seen before, even from experienced helicopter pilots operating in similar terrain. What struck Williams most was the way Sarah had adapted her tactics as the mission progressed, learning from each attack run and adjusting her approach to overcome the enemy's defensive measures. She had demonstrated not just exceptional flying skills but the tactical flexibility that Special Operations Forces valued most in their air support assets. Her performance had exceeded every expectation the SEALs had brought to the mission. The formal debriefing that followed was attended by senior officers from multiple services, all eager to understand how such a challenging mission had been executed successfully. Colonel Thompson presided over the session, but much of the questioning came from Special Operations commanders who wanted to incorporate the lessons learned into future planning. The Narrow Valley rescue was already being studied as a case example of what was possible when pilot skill met aircraft capability. Sarah walked the assembled officers through her decision-making process during each phase of the mission, explaining how she had analyzed the terrain and threats to develop effective attack routes. The key had been understanding the A-10's unique capabilities and using them to overcome limitations that would have defeated other aircraft. The Thunderbolt's slow speed and exceptional maneuverability had allowed her to operate in spaces where faster jets would have been useless. The weapons system performance had been critical to the mission's success. The GAU-8 cannon's precision and devastating power had allowed Sarah to engage point targets with confidence, even when operating at minimum safe distances from friendly forces. The mix of cannon fire, rockets, and precision-guided munitions had given her the flexibility to adapt to different target types and tactical situations as they developed. Perhaps most importantly, the mission had demonstrated the value of thorough preparation and realistic training. Sarah's years of experience flying low-level missions in mountainous terrain had prepared her for the specific challenges of the Narrow Valley, even though the conditions were more extreme than anything she had previously encountered. The thousands of hours she had spent mastering her aircraft had paid dividends when precision flying became a matter of life and death. As the debriefing concluded, several of the SEALs who had initially expressed skepticism about the mission approached Sarah privately to offer their congratulations and respect. Petty Officer Rodriguez, who had questioned whether any pilot could fly low enough to be effective, admitted that he had never seen anything like her performance. The demonstration had fundamentally changed his understanding of what was possible with close air support in restrictive terrain. Staff Sergeant Patterson, the veteran who had stated flatly that no pilot could fly low enough to make a real difference, was more direct in his assessment. He told Sarah that her flying had been the most impressive display of airmanship he had witnessed in 15 years of special operations, and that he would never again doubt what an A-10 pilot could accomplish when lives were on the line. His words carried extra weight because of his initial skepticism and extensive combat experience. The rescued aircrew members sought out Sarah as soon as they were medically cleared to do so. Captain Mike Reaper Thompson, the pilot of the downed helicopter, had been conscious throughout most of the rescue operation and had watched Sarah's attack runs from his position near the crash site. His description of seeing the A-10 diving between the mountain peaks while under heavy fire brought home the reality of what she had accomplished. Technical Sergeant Lisa Doc Rodriguez, the helicopter's medic, had treated the wounded crew members while Sarah's attacks raged around them. She described the psychological impact of hearing the GAU-8 cannon and seeing enemy positions systematically destroyed by precisely delivered fire. The sound of the A-10's engines had become a symbol of hope for the trapped survivors, representing the cavalry coming to their rescue. Senior Master Sergeant David Chief Williams, the helicopter's crew chief, had been the most seriously wounded of the survivors but had remained alert enough to coordinate with the rescue teams. His assessment was that without Sarah's air support, the enemy would have overrun their position long before the rescue helicopters could have reached them. Her willingness to fly at such low altitudes under heavy fire had been the decisive factor in their survival. The mission's success had implications far beyond the immediate rescue operation. Senior commanders began incorporating the tactical lessons into doctrine and training programs, recognizing that the Narrow Valley Rescue had demonstrated capabilities that could be applied to future operations. The A-10's performance in restrictive terrain was better understood, and pilot training was modified to include more emphasis on precision flying in mountainous environments. Media attention followed the story, though most of the specific details remained classified to protect operational security. What emerged publicly was a tale of exceptional airmanship and determination that captured the imagination of aviation enthusiasts and military professionals alike. Sarah found herself representing not just her own accomplishments but the capabilities of all A-10 pilots who had trained for exactly such challenging missions. The aircraft itself became something of a legend within the A-10 community. Tail number 78-0691 was repaired and returned to service, but it carried the distinction of having completed one of the most challenging close air support missions ever recorded. The battle damage it had sustained while continuing to fly effectively demonstrated the Thunderbolt's legendary durability under extreme conditions. Recognition for the mission came in various forms, from official commendations to informal acknowledgement from fellow pilots and ground forces. Sarah received the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions, but she was quick to point out that the mission's success had depended on the efforts of many people, from the ground crews who maintained her aircraft to the SEALs who provided terminal guidance for her attacks. The long-term impact of the Narrow Valley Rescue extended beyond individual recognition to influence broader military thinking about close air support in restrictive terrain. The mission proved that with proper training, equipment, and determination, seemingly impossible challenges could be overcome. It became a case study taught in military schools and a source of inspiration for pilots facing their own difficult missions. Years later, Sarah would reflect on the Narrow Valley Rescue as a defining moment in her career, not because of the personal recognition it brought but because of what it demonstrated about the possibilities that emerged when human skill and technological capability were pushed to their absolute limits. The SEALs who had claimed no one could fly that low had been proven wrong, but, more importantly, lives had been saved through a combination of courage, skill, and determination that exemplified the best traditions of military aviation. The mission stood as proof that when the stakes were highest and conventional wisdom suggested that success was impossible, the right person with the right training and the right aircraft could still find a way to accomplish the mission and bring everyone home alive. It was a lesson that would influence military aviation for generations to come. Of the pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Bugram Airfield like a heavy blanket as Major Sarah Martinez conducted her pre-flight inspection of the A-10 Thunderbolt. Her flashlight beam danced across the aircraft's surfaces, checking every rivet, every panel, every external system that would keep her alive in the coming hours. The familiar ritual of the inspection helped calm her nerves, each step a reminder of the thousands of hours she had spent mastering this formidable machine. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Wrench Coleman, her crew chief, worked alongside her with the practiced efficiency of someone who had prepared aircraft for countless dangerous missions. Wrench had been maintaining A-10s for 12 years, and she understood better than most what the aircraft could and couldn't do. As they worked together in the darkness, she expressed quiet confidence in both the plane and its pilot, but Sarah could sense the underlying concern in her voice. The weather briefing had been sobering. Mountain winds were picking up, creating turbulence that would make low-level flight even more challenging than normal. Cloud cover was building over the target area, reducing visibility and making navigation more difficult. The conditions weren't ideal, but they weren't bad enough to scrub the mission. The downed aircrew couldn't wait for perfect weather. As Sarah climbed into the cockpit, she felt the familiar embrace of the ejection seat and the comforting weight of her helmet. The cockpit of an A-10 was like a second home to her, every switch and display positioned exactly where she expected it to be. She had flown this particular aircraft, tail number 78-0691, on dozens of missions, and it had never let her down. Today would be its ultimate test. The engine start sequence proceeded normally, the twin General Electric turbofans spinning up with their characteristic whine before settling into a steady rumble. Sarah ran through her systems checks methodically, verifying that every component was functioning properly. The 30mm cannon showed a full load of depleted uranium rounds, each one capable of destroying an armored vehicle with a single hit. Her external stores included rockets and precision-guided bombs that would give her multiple options for engaging enemy positions. Radio communications crackled to life as the mission commander coordinated the various elements of the rescue operation. Rescue helicopters were standing by at a forward staging area, waiting for Sarah to clear the landing zone of enemy forces. SEAL teams on the ground were in position to provide terminal guidance for her attacks, using laser designators and radio calls to direct her fire with surgical precision. The taxi to the runway seemed to take forever, but finally, Sarah found herself lined up on the centerline with clearance for takeoff. The A-10's engines spooled up to full power, and she released the brakes, feeling the aircraft accelerate down the runway with its characteristic deliberate pace. Unlike the sleek fighters that shared the airfield, the A-10 was built for endurance and survivability rather than speed, and it showed in every aspect of its performance. Lifting off into the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah turned toward the mountains that held the crash site. The flight to the target area would take 45 minutes, giving her time to review the mission parameters one more time and mentally rehearse the attack run she would need to execute. The valley was oriented north to south, with the crash site located near the southern end where the terrain was most constricted. As the sun began to rise behind her, painting the mountains in shades of gold and orange, Sarah could see the target area emerging from the morning shadows. The valley looked even more intimidating from the air than it had on the maps, its walls rising almost vertically from a narrow floor that seemed barely wide enough for her aircraft. Enemy muzzle flashes were already visible from the ridgelines, indicating that the Taliban fighters were well aware of the approaching aircraft. The first radio call from the ground came from Lieutenant Commander Williams, whose voice carried the urgency of men under fire. The enemy was pressing their attack on the crash site, and the survivors were running low on ammunition. They needed immediate close air support to buy time for the rescue helicopters to reach the area safely. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and began her descent toward the valley mouth. Flying at 200 feet above the valley floor, Sarah could see tracer rounds reaching up toward her aircraft from multiple enemy positions. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves on both sides of the valley, creating a crossfire that any aircraft would have to penetrate to reach the crash site. Small arms fire began to ping against her aircraft's armored hull, but the titanium bathtub around the cockpit shrugged off the impacts without effect. The first target was a machine gun position located on the eastern ridge, approximately 800 meters from the crash site. Sarah rolled into a steep dive, lining up the 30mm cannon with the enemy position while pulling enough gravitational force to make her vision narrow at the edges. The GAU-8 cannon erupted with its distinctive sound, like a giant zipper being pulled apart, as high-velocity rounds tore into the enemy position with devastating effect. Rolling out of the attack run, Sarah found herself flying between the valley walls with less than 50 feet of clearance on either side. The mountains rose like towering walls around her aircraft, blocking out much of the sky and creating an almost claustrophobic environment. She had never flown in terrain quite this restrictive, but the A-10 responded to her control inputs with the precision she needed to navigate the narrow space safely. The second target was more challenging, a rocket-propelled grenade team positioned in a cave on the western slope. Sarah had to execute a complex maneuver to line up the shot, pulling the aircraft into a knife-edge pass that brought her within 30 feet of the mountainside. The precision required was extraordinary, but she managed to put a burst of cannon fire directly into the cave mouth, silencing the enemy position permanently. As she continued to work her way up the valley, engaging target after target, Sarah began to understand why the SEALs had been skeptical about the mission. The flying was unlike anything in her previous experience, requiring constant attention to clearances and obstacles while simultaneously managing weapons systems and responding to threats. One moment of inattention would send her aircraft into the mountainside with no possibility of recovery. The enemy began to adapt to her tactics, repositioning their weapons to create new firing positions and trying to anticipate her attack routes. Several times, Sarah had to abort attack runs when enemy fire became too intense, pulling up and around to try a different approach. The Taliban fighters were experienced and well-coordinated, making every pass a life-or-death struggle. Midway through the mission, Sarah's aircraft took a significant hit from a rocket-propelled grenade that detonated close enough to her left engine to cause damage warnings to illuminate throughout the cockpit. The engine continued to run, but at reduced power, forcing her to compensate with increased throttle on the remaining engine. The asymmetric thrust made the aircraft more difficult to control, especially during the precise maneuvering required for the narrow valley. Despite the damage, Sarah continued her attacks, methodically destroying enemy positions and clearing the way for the rescue operation. Her ammunition was running low, but she still had enough ordnance to deal with the remaining threats around the crash site. Each successful attack brought the rescue helicopters one step closer to being able to land safely and extract the survivors. The radio crackled with updates from the ground forces, confirming successful hits on target after target. Lieutenant Commander Williams' voice carried a note of amazement as he reported that the enemy fire was diminishing significantly with each of Sarah's attack runs. The precision of her gunnery was extraordinary, especially considering the challenging flying conditions and the close proximity of friendly forces to the targets. As Sarah lined up for what would be her final attack run, targeting the last major enemy position threatening the landing zone, she reflected on how the mission had evolved. What had started as a debate about whether such flying was even possible had become a demonstration of what could be accomplished when pilot and aircraft worked together at the absolute limits of their capabilities. The final target was the most challenging yet, a heavy machine gun position located on a narrow ledge that could only be reached from a specific angle of attack. Sarah would have to fly directly between two rock spires, threading the A-10 through a gap barely wider than her wingspan while under heavy fire. The margin for error was essentially zero, but the position had to be eliminated before the helicopters could safely approach. Rolling into the attack run, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the most dangerous moments of combat flying. Tracer rounds filled the air around her aircraft as she dove toward the target, the mountain walls flashing past her wingtips with terrifying proximity. At the last possible moment, she pulled the trigger and watched as her final burst of cannon fire struck the enemy position with perfect accuracy. Pulling out of the valley at maximum climb rate, Sarah's damaged aircraft struggled to gain altitude, but it continued to fly. Behind her, the radio was alive with confirmation that the last major threat had been eliminated and that the rescue helicopters were beginning their approach to the landing zone. The mission that the SEALs had claimed was impossible had been completed successfully, opening the way for the rescue of the downed aircrew. As she turned toward home, nursing her wounded aircraft through the mountain passes, Sarah realized that she had just participated in something historic. The flying she had accomplished in that narrow valley would be talked about for years to come, not just because of its technical difficulty but because it had proven that the right pilot and the right aircraft could overcome seemingly impossible odds when lives hung in the balance. Major Sarah Phoenix Martinez had been flying A-10 Thunderbolts for 8 years, but she had never faced a challenge quite like this one. The morning sun cast long shadows across Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan as she walked toward the briefing room, her flight suit crisp despite the early hour. The sound of her boots on the concrete echoed in the quiet dawn air, mixing with the distant hum of aircraft engines warming up for the day's missions. The briefing room was packed with more people than usual. Along the back wall stood a group of Navy SEALs, their presence immediately noticeable by their quiet confidence and the way they seemed to assess everything around them. Sarah had worked with Special Operations Forces before, providing close air support for their missions, but today felt different. There was intention in the air that she couldn't quite place. Colonel James Hawk Thompson, the squadron commander, stood at the front of the room with a map of the Hindu Kush Mountains displayed on the large screen behind him. His weathered face showed the strain of too many difficult decisions and sleepless nights. As the room settled into silence, he began to speak in his characteristic direct manner. The mission was unlike anything Sarah had heard before. A team of Navy SEALs had been conducting reconnaissance deep in enemy territory when their extraction helicopter had been shot down. The crash site was in a narrow valley, surrounded by steep mountains that rose like jagged teeth into the sky. The valley was so narrow that it seemed impossible for any aircraft to navigate safely through it, especially while under enemy fire. What made the situation even more critical was the enemy presence in the area. Taliban fighters had quickly surrounded the crash site and were closing in on the survivors. The SEALs on the ground had limited ammunition and no way to escape on foot. Time was running out, and conventional rescue operations had been deemed too risky due to the terrain and heavy enemy presence. Lieutenant Commander Jake Razor Williams, the SEAL team leader, stepped forward to address the room. His voice was steady but carried the weight of men's lives hanging in the balance. He explained that they needed close air support to clear the enemy positions around the crash site, but the valley was too narrow for most aircraft to operate safely. The mountains on either side rose over 3,000 feet, creating a natural funnel that would trap any pilot who dared to enter. Sarah listened intently as Razor described the tactical situation. The enemy had positioned machine gun nests on the ridgelines, giving them overlapping fields of fire across the valley floor. Any aircraft attempting to provide support would have to fly extremely low to avoid surface-to-air missiles while somehow maneuvering through the narrow space between the mountains. It was a pilot's nightmare scenario. As the briefing continued, Sarah noticed several of the SEALs exchanging glances and quiet comments among themselves. Their expressions suggested they were discussing something beyond the official mission parameters. She had seen that look before, the way special operations personnel evaluated risks and made their own assessments independent of what they were being told. When Colonel Thompson asked for questions, one of the younger SEALs raised his hand. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Tank Rodriguez looked directly at Sarah as he spoke, his tone respectful but skeptical. He wanted to know if the Air Force pilots really understood how low they would need to fly to be effective in that terrain. The mountains would force any aircraft down to treetop level, where the margin for error was essentially zero. Sarah felt the room's attention shift toward her as she stood to respond. She had flown low-level missions before, threading the A-10 through mountain passes and urban environments where inches mattered. The Thunderbolt, affectionately known as the Warthog, was built for exactly this type of mission. Its twin engines were mounted high on the fuselage to protect them from ground fire, and its titanium armor could withstand significant damage while still bringing the pilot home safely. But, as she began to explain the A-10's capabilities, another SEAL interrupted with a comment that would change the entire dynamic of the mission. Staff Sergeant Mike Ghost Patterson, a veteran of numerous special operations, stated flatly that no pilot could fly low enough to be truly effective in that valley. He had been in similar situations before, and, in his experience, fixed-wing aircraft simply couldn't operate at the altitudes necessary to make a real difference against entrenched enemy positions. The comments sparked a debate that revealed the fundamental disconnect between the ground forces and the pilots. The SEALs, having operated in similar terrain, believed that only helicopters could provide the kind of close support they needed. Fixed-wing aircraft, they argued, would be forced to stay too high to accurately engage targets, making their support largely ineffective when precision was critical. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of having to defend not just her own abilities but the capabilities of her aircraft. She explained that the A-10 was specifically designed for close air support missions, with its 30mm GAU-8 cannon capable of precise fire even at low altitudes. The aircraft's slow speed and exceptional maneuverability made it ideal for operating in confined spaces where faster jets would be useless. The tension in the room was palpable as the discussion continued. Colonel Thompson tried to maintain order, but it was clear that the SEALs had serious doubts about the mission's feasibility. They weren't questioning the courage or dedication of the pilots, but they had seen too many missions fail because of unrealistic expectations about what aircraft could accomplish in mountainous terrain. Lieutenant Commander Williams finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the debate with military precision. He acknowledged that the Air Force pilots were skilled and experienced, but he also expressed concern about asking them to attempt something that might be beyond the physical limitations of their aircraft. The valley was simply too narrow, the mountains too high, and the enemy too well positioned for conventional close air support tactics to work. Sarah realized that this wasn't just about the immediate mission anymore. It was about proving that she and her aircraft could deliver when conventional wisdom said it was impossible. The lives of the downed aircrew depended on someone being willing to take risks that others considered suicidal. She looked around the room at the faces staring back at her, seeing a mixture of hope, skepticism, and concern. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders as she made a decision that would define not just this mission but, potentially, her entire career. Standing straighter, she looked directly at Lieutenant Commander Williams and stated clearly that she could fly low enough to make the mission work. The A-10 was built for exactly this type of challenge, and she had the experience and skill necessary to navigate the valley successfully. The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Colonel Thompson studied her face, looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. The SEALs exchanged glances again, their expressions unreadable. Finally, Williams nodded slowly and said that if she was willing to try, they would coordinate the mission and provide all possible support from the ground. As the briefing concluded and personnel began filing out of the room, Sarah remained behind to study the tactical maps more carefully. The valley looked even more intimidating when viewed in detail, its walls rising steeply on both sides like a natural fortress. The crash site was located at the narrowest point, where the space between the mountains was barely wide enough for safe aircraft operations under ideal conditions. But these weren't ideal conditions, and Sarah knew that success would require flying lower than she had ever flown before in combat. The enemy positions would force her to stay below the ridgelines to avoid their most effective weapons, putting her aircraft in constant danger from small arms fire and rocket-propelled grenades. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and she would join the downed aircrew she was trying to rescue. Walking back to her quarters to prepare for the mission, Sarah reflected on the challenge she had just accepted. The SEALs weren't wrong to be skeptical. What she was proposing was extremely dangerous and had never been attempted in terrain quite like this. But she also knew that the A-10 was uniquely suited for this type of mission, and her years of experience had prepared her for exactly this moment. The sound of aircraft engines filled the air as the base came alive with activity. Other pilots were preparing for their own missions, but none faced the same level of risk and uncertainty that lay ahead for Sarah. She thought about the downed aircrew waiting for rescue and the SEALs who were counting on her to prove that their skepticism was misplaced. As she reached her quarters, Sarah made a mental note to spend extra time reviewing the terrain maps and weather forecasts. Every detail would matter when she was flying at treetop level through hostile territory. The mission would test not just her flying skills but her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure while making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between success and disaster. The challenge had been issued, and she had accepted it. Now came the hard part, proving that what the SEALs claimed was impossible was actually within reach of a skilled pilot flying the right aircraft. The next few hours would determine whether her confidence was justified or if she had just committed herself to an impossible task that could cost her everything.